We are starting a short series this week on the book of Leviticus. Now, how many of you have ever heard a sermon on Leviticus? Well, you're going to get to hear 3 now, because we're going to do a series of 3 sermons, then it's Thanksgiving, and then it's on to Advent. But Leviticus is one of those books that I think sometimes we can come with a little bit of fear and trepidation as we come and approach it and study it. I mean, let's be honest, it is a little bit strange sometimes. It is different than what we're used to in our daily lives. We don't sacrifice animals. We do not follow the food rules that are prescribed in Leviticus. We do not make distinctions between clean and unclean unless we're thinking about our kids' rooms or something like that. And so we can kind of be wondering, is Leviticus even relevant to us today? Right? It's historical and it's part of the Bible, and maybe it gives us some background into understanding Jesus and understanding what He has done for us, the magnitude of it on the cross. But you may be kind of thinking, look, Pastor, do we really need to go in depth into Leviticus? Because it can seem kind of weird. But what's interesting to me is that rabbis in the Jewish tradition begin their instruction of young Jewish students. Do you know where they begin instructing those students? Leviticus. And so there is something very important here that we need to look at. There is something that helps us get at the heart of who the God of Israel is and how He has spoken once and for all in Jesus Christ. I'm convinced that Leviticus has something to teach us. And so if it seems kind of weird sometimes, then maybe we just got to embrace the weirdness. I am convinced that the same God who breathed Leviticus and who gave the laws of Leviticus is the God who spoke most fully through Jesus Christ, the God who we adore, the one that we pray to, the one that we worship. He is the author of Leviticus. And so I think we've got something to learn from Leviticus. And one of the deepest themes in Leviticus is holiness. And that is really going to be the center of what we're going to talk about these next couple of weeks. The theme for these 3 weeks is holy God, holy people. And looking at how Leviticus constructs us as holy people of God and how it points us towards life with the holy God. And today we're looking at chapter 1 of Leviticus, which is focused on offerings. And I want to help us here today that a holy offering reorients our lives towards God. Okay, so when we make an offering, a holy offering, it gets everything else in line in our lives so that we are able to connect and focus on the holy God. And you'll see here in Leviticus, in this first chapter, that there are 5 offerings, or not this first chapter, but in the first 6 chapters, there are 5 offerings. In the first chapter, it's the burnt offering, and there are 3 different versions of the burnt offering that we're going to look at in a second. But there are 5 offerings that are mentioned here. The burnt offering, chapter 2, then the cereal offering, so bringing grain in different forms, the peace offering, the purification offering, the reparation offering. Sometimes people use different names for some of these. And so the first 6 chapters of Leviticus talk about those offerings, the first 3 chapters talk about those offerings, and then they are from the perspective of the person who is bringing them, and then chapters 4 through 7 speak about those offerings from this perspective of the priest, and then in chapter 8 there is more information about how priests are ordained, and there's this further development of the priestly ministry. But Leviticus begins with offerings. And what I want to do this morning, and what we're going to do really each week a little bit, is I want to talk about Leviticus, but then I want to connect Leviticus to Jesus and who we are now as His people and how we're called to live now. Because I'm convinced that Leviticus, with all of this detailed instruction about burnt offerings and priesthood and altars and the tabernacle and the food laws and the ways of life, I am convinced that Leviticus is relevant to our lives. It is relevant. And part of the question that we got to ask is, what is relevance anyway? Because, relevance can be this really tricky term that we throw around sometimes. And I think in the best sense, relevance just means something that matters to us. Because when we come to church, we want something that is relevant, that helps us live our life before God. That makes sense, right? I mean, we want that. We want to hear a sermon that connects with who we are, points us towards God. It's relevant. It's what we're looking for. And I get that, right? I want that for all of us. But, we want something on Sunday morning that helps us live. But I think one of the reasons that Leviticus is just so great for us to hear, and just as a book, is that the reason that Leviticus is relevant is that it is so not relevant to our situation. It is relevant because it is not relevant. And if you follow what I'm saying, Leviticus just totally challenges our sense of what is important, of what is relevant. Leviticus just refuses to meet our needs. And I think the reason for this, and I think this is the reason that we've got to hear from Leviticus, is because it is so utterly and single-mindedly focused on obedience to God and the formation of God's people as a holy people who can live with the holy God. And Leviticus just says so clearly, it is not about us. It is not about our comfort. It is about the holy God who calls a holy people. And so that's what we got to hear each week in Leviticus. And the other thing I love about Leviticus, and really what I love about the Bible in general, is that it is so concrete. We can kind of sometimes get the idea in our modern moment that loving God and worshiping God is something that happens up here in our mind or maybe here in our hearts. But Leviticus shows us that if we're going to worship God, it's going to look like something. It's going to be concrete. And holiness is concrete. And holiness is something that has got to kind of be worked into us if it's going to be real holiness. And you see this in Leviticus, right from the beginning. We call this book Leviticus because it has a lot to say about how the proper worship is supposed to happen in the Israelite faith, and that is worship that the Levites, right? Leviticus, Levites, it's worship that the Levites make possible. And the Levites are the priestly tribe, right? They are the tribe that the priests are chosen from. Aaron was part of that tribe, as was Moses. But in Hebrew, Leviticus is simply called Vayikra. Can we say that together? Vayikra. And what Vayikra means is called. And you see this in Leviticus 1:1, and it's reversed, the order of it's reversed in Hebrew a little bit. It says in Hebrew, called Moses the Lord did. And so the very first word of Leviticus is called. And so it's a book that's about how God calls and how God spoke to Moses and called the people. And so it is all about God speaking to Moses at the tent of meeting. It is all about God calling his people. It begins with God calling and taking the initiative. It begins with God who calls Moses so that he can instruct everybody. God speaks, Moses listens, Vayikra. And so God is 100% the focus here. God's calling is the focus in Leviticus. That's what it's called, Vayikra. God called in Hebrew. And you see this, if you're following along, you see this in 1:2, in that second verse. God says, speak to the Israelites and say to them that when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd or the flock. And then this is followed by 3 if statements. And you can find these in verse 3. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd. Then verse 10, if the offering is a burnt offering from the flock. And then verse 14, if the offering of the Lord is a burnt offering of the birds. And so you've got these 3 different kinds of offerings. They are all under the general heading of a burnt offering, which in Hebrew is called an olah offering. It's not Spanish, it's not olah, it's an olah. That means what wafts up to God, what raises up to God, because that smoke, and you see this line repeated, it is a burnt offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord, because that smoke rises to God and is pleasing to God. So it's an offering that rises up to God. And there are these three kinds, which is really wonderful. And really in chapter 2, the grain offering is kind of part of this, because if you can't offer a bird, you can at least bring grain. Like you can bring wheat, or you can bring wheat that's been hulled, or you can bring little cakes. But that's kind of an extension of the burnt offering. And what's really wonderful about that is that God's calling his people, and he invites them to offer and respond in offering to him. But he holds all of these offerings in equal esteem. And so some can afford a bull, and some can afford a sheep or a goat, and it's got to be a male in each case for this particular kind of offering. Some a bird. It doesn't say anything about whether the bird has to be male or female, and I don't know if that's because it's kind of hard to tell when you're offering a young bird if it's a male or female, but it doesn't say anything there. Some can only afford grain, but all of them can be burned on the altar, and all of them give off an aroma that is pleasing to the Lord. But as long as it is something valuable, as long as it is something given from the heart, it is an offering that is acceptable to God. And I think about this a little bit, even if you look back at like 2 Samuel 24, where David, after he made the mistake of trying to count all the Israelite men to see, what kind of an army he could pull together, there's this moment where he then he's going to make an offering to God to set things straight, and he wants to give an offering at a piece of property that belongs to a guy named Araunah, and he says, "I'll just give it to you, king." Araunah says, "I'll just give it to you." And David says, "No, I will not offer to the Lord my God an offering which cost me nothing." Right? So there's this idea of bringing something of value, but God accepts each person who worships God, bringing whatever it is that is of value to them. He doesn't say that rich people who have the bull are better off than those who can only bring the bird or the grain. God accepts and embraces all who come and sincerely offer something of value to him. And if we're going to understand this a little bit, we kind of got to get at the context just a little bit, because we need to look at where this offering is happening. And God calls Moses to the tent of meeting. And the tent of meeting in the Old Testament and the Torah is simply another way of speaking of the tabernacle. And we've probably all heard of the tabernacle, because during the journeys of the Israelites in the wilderness, the tabernacle was the place where they worshiped God and where they would meet God. And God had instructed them to make this tent. There are very detailed instructions in the book of Exodus that talk about how the tent is to be constructed. They're supposed to make this tent. That's going to be the center of their worship of him. And in fact, all the Israelite tribes, as they camped in the desert, were arranged with the tabernacle at the center, with the tabernacle, and all the tribes were facing that tabernacle. It's where God met his people. It's where they offered their sacrifices. And I want to show you a little picture of it. I don't know how much you can make out of this picture of the tabernacle, but you've got different layers. The first is the outside. So imagine all the Israelites arranged around that, and then here's the beginning of the holy part, because it's the courtyard, so to speak. Here is the altar where a fire is kept. Here's where they wash their hands and wash their implements. Here is the tabernacle itself, and inside the tabernacle you have a first place which has the gold-plated table where the bread of the presence is kept, as well as a menorah, a candlestick that's always lit to God, and a little altar of incense. And then here is the veil that separates the rest of the tabernacle from the Holy of Holies. And inside that veil is where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, you remember that you can find the Ten Commandments, the tablets, the staff of Aaron that budded, and a golden jar of manna. And so there's a movement, right? Out here you have the world, and then you have the Israelites, and then you have the courtyard, and then you have the first holy place, and then the most holy of holies right there in the center. And so there are very detailed instructions about how they bring their offering into that area, and then how the sacrifices are to be carried out. And this is kind of important, because the person who is bringing the offering comes before the tent of meeting, and you can see there's a little picture of a cow or something there. they come before the tent of meeting, and they're going to lay their hand on the head of the animal that they're going to offer. And that's probably a way of declaring ownership and kind of identifying with this animal that they're going to bring in and offer to God. It's in Leviticus chapter 16, there's the Day of Atonement and the scapegoat ritual. And in the scapegoat ritual, they confess their sins over the head of the goat and then drive the goat out into the desert. This is a little bit like that, but also different. They're not confessing sins over the animal, but just simply laying their hands on the animal. And then the priest, the animal's slaughtered. In this picture, there are little tables that they call slaughter tables. That detail I haven't found in Leviticus, but in Ezekiel, Ezekiel talks about the new temple, which will have these tables for the slaughtering. And so it would make sense that there were some tables here around the tabernacle too, where the slaughtering happened. But so the priest slaughters the animal, takes the certain internal organs, burns them on the altar, and then sprinkles the blood on each side of the altar. And some of the sacrifices talk about which sides of the altar. And the burnt offering, it's all sides of the altar. And I'm going somewhere with this. The altar is interesting. The altar itself is very interesting. Because, I've always kind of had the idea, maybe you have too, that the altar was the place, kind of a table, the place where the animal was killed. But that is actually not the case. And you think about like Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham brings Isaac, his own son, and he lays him down on an altar out in the wilderness, and he's going to kill him right there on the altar. But then God says, no, do not touch the boy. But I always thought about that in terms of the animal sacrifice, as if the animal itself were killed on the altar. But that's not the case. The way it usually worked is for the animal to be killed, and then the priest took the internal organs up to the altar and took certain parts of the animal up to the altar and burned them and then dashed the blood around the altar. But the animal was not killed on the altar itself. Rather, the altar is where the sacrifice is offered. Okay, now here's where it starts to get down to brass tacks for us as Christians, because we no longer offer sacrifice to God, blood sacrifice to God, right? We don't offer blood sacrifice. Why not? Well, the reason is because, as the letter to the Hebrews put it, the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming. And the Israelite priests, they had to continuously offer the various sacrifices to God because that was the only way that they could approach the holy God. And the tabernacle was the center of all of this, and then it became moved over to the temple under David. But the tabernacle was the center for all of this, and it had to happen continuously because as human beings, it is our very nature to not be holy. And as God, it is His very nature to be holy. And so the only thing that the sins of the people could be paid for with was blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so the tabernacle and the altar and the rituals and the cleanliness, they're all the centerpiece of Israelite worship, and that's later moved to the temple. But when Jesus died on the cross outside of Jerusalem, He was the perfect sacrifice, and His blood fulfilled forever the atonement for sin before God. And in Hebrews, this is spelled out in great deal, because in Hebrews we read that Jesus is the high priest, and Jesus is the sacrifice itself, and Jesus is the altar, and Jesus tabernacled among us, and Jesus, His body is the temple, and Jesus' body is also the curtain that separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the tabernacle. And so all blood sacrifice, all of that ritual, all of that paraphernalia that was required is all fulfilled and resolved in Jesus forever. And that aroma that is pleasing to God, that continues to waft up before God wherever God's people meet for worship, which is why Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2:15 that we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. And so that sacrifice has happened once and for all. And Hebrews 10:10 says, We've been sacrificed through the offering of the blood of Jesus once for all. But the more we enter into the knowledge and the life and the presence of Jesus, and the more we are made holy, and we are cleansed with his blood, and we're able to live out a holy life before God. And so the thing is that holiness is really this thread that holds it all together, binds it all together. And last month, we talked about grace. And for these next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about holiness. And sometimes we can kind of think that like grace is over here and holiness is over here, and they're sort of these polar opposites, right? That they just never meet. But I think in reality, there's something more wonderful going on. And if you just look at Leviticus, you kind of see this, because it begins with God graciously calling Moses and the people of Israel. And then God graciously chooses his people. And I mean, they didn't do anything to earn that. God just called them. It was pure grace. They didn't do anything, not one thing, to merit that choosing. But then, after that calling, God draws forth in them and inculcates in them a deep holiness and a way of living with him as the holy God. And God is holy, and he calls his people to be holy. And so I think really when we start to look at the way the scriptures talk about holiness and grace, we see that they fit together quite beautifully. And here in Leviticus chapter 1, we see how holiness and offering come together. And a holy offering really reorients our lives towards God, because we got to ask ourselves, what exactly is holiness? We can think about living lives that are pure and pleasing to God. And we can think about moral purity. And the essence of holiness the true heart of what it means to be holiness is to be set apart. I mean, it's to be set apart for God's work. It's to be set apart for life with God. It's to be set apart for God himself. And I think a sacrifice is something that is set apart. It's something that is given to God. And this is how holiness and sacrifice and offering all fit together, because a sacrifice is what opens up the road to holiness. And that is why the very first thing that God talks about in Leviticus, which is what the whole book of Leviticus is dedicated to showing, is that this way of pervasive holiness in every aspect of our lives, that this way of holiness begins first in sacrifice. Because when we learn to set apart something of value for God, to give it to God and to invest our joy and our happiness in God's being pleased by the aroma of what we give to him, then I think that kind of turns our whole value system on end, changes the way we look at life. And this is where it matters that the sacrifice, here's where we're going all the way back to the beginning, this is where it matters that the sacrifice is offered on the altar, but not made and killed on the altar. So the sacrifice happened before getting to that offering on the altar. And the sacrifice is even sort of a process, right? Because if you think about it, the person who is going to bring an animal to the tabernacle and kill that animal, and then the priest is going to offer it on the altar, that sacrifice really has to happen back in the herd, back at the flock, where the person is saying, I'm going to pick out my best animal and bring this to God. The person has to determine that they're going to live their life so that they can bring this to God. So it's completed on the altar when the priest transforms the sacrifice into an aroma pleasing to God, but there's this whole other attitude and this whole other ordering of life that comes first and makes it possible. And there's this whole set of values that makes it possible to bring the offering. And so even though Jesus has fulfilled the demands of the blood sacrifice once and for all, we are still called to emulate the people of Israel and to come with this heart of holy offering. Because you see, holiness is a life lived set apart and oriented to God, and we are called to orient our lives toward God by making a holy offering to him. So are you following what I'm saying on this? That it's a holy offering that leads to a holy way of life of God, to a life that is offered to God, and that attitude is still valid. And one of the ways that we make a holy offering to God is to come with our tithes. And you see how that shifts your whole way of life around, because if you're going to give a tenth of your income to God, then you've got to know how much income you have, and you've got to arrange things so that you're able to live without that portion of your income. But you've got to set priorities so that your cash and your needs make sense and all come together. But honestly, this is the way it is for everything, isn't it? Because if something is important to us, then we have to reorder our lives so that we can make that thing happen. And I'll give you an example. This is going to surprise some of you. Last week, we watched the World Series. We rooted for the Royals. We watched every game. This is not something that we normally do. We are not huge into sports, but we had so much fun doing it and cheering for the Royals and getting kind of crazy for the Royals. But part of being able to do that meant that we had to make a little sacrifice. We had to lose a little bit of sleep. And then our sons, they didn't stay up till the very end of the game, but we had to make a little sacrifice then because they couldn't go to sleep at their normal time, and then we had to drive them to school. And so we had to rearrange our lives for a couple of days to make something happen that was very deeply important to us, that we valued. We had to make a little sacrifice. Now, I know that's just a tiny little example, but this is how we live our lives. We do the things that are important to us. And this isn't just about giving a tithe, not just about sacrificing money for God. It wasn't like that. It's not just that now. Just like for the Israelites, it wasn't just about bringing an animal sacrifice. It's about this whole way of life that's oriented towards God, that is holy. It's about making God our top priority. And everything else trickles out and is rearranged according to God's purposes. And when we can say that God is our priority, and we can say that we intend to orient our lives towards God, but until we really put our money and our lives and our time and our hearts where our mouths are, then it's not going to be real for us. We're not going to be serious about it. And this is why Jesus said, store up your treasure in heaven, because where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Where we put our treasure is where we put our hearts. And this is the beauty of Leviticus. This is what is so attractive to me about Leviticus, because it is all in. It is this complete way of life that is centered in offering ourselves to God. And even though the blood sacrifice and the ritual laws and the food laws have all been perfectly fulfilled in Jesus, this attitude, this devotion, this dedication to God and to holiness, that continues. And we are still called to have this attitude of sacrifice to God. And you see this in the New Testament. I mean, this is why Hebrews says, bring a sacrifice of praise. This is why Paul says in Romans that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. That's our spiritual worship. That's why Paul writes in the Philippians that he talks about an offering of faith. That's why Peter wrote in 1 Peter that we are living stones, and let yourselves be built up into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. We're still called to live like this. We are still called to respond to God and to bring our best. We are still called to come and make an offering to Him. And you know what? I think that we desperately need this vivid kind of holiness, this capacity to sacrifice. I mean, we need to sacrifice. We need to bring an offering, because without it, life just becomes one thing after another. And I think we are all longing, or at least I am personally longing, to live for something beyond ourselves, beyond myself, something that matters. And I think sometimes we can kind of come under the illusion that, we're just fine the way we are, and we just really like to kind of live our lives and be left alone. But the reality is that we're going to give our lives to something. And it may be work, and it may be kids, and it may be baseball, and it may be chocolate cake, but we are going to give our lives to something. And if we don't bring an offering, and if we don't learn this attitude of making all that we are a holy offering to God, then I think at some point all the rest of life loses its meaning and becomes pale. We need holiness. We need this life set apart to God to make human life all that is supposed to be. And we use this word sacrifice, and sometimes we can kind of have a negative sense of it, right? It's like giving something up. But sacrifice, it's like, well, I'll sacrifice a little, I'll work a little harder, kind of sacrifice today so that tomorrow I can take a break, something like that. But when we talk about sacrifice with God, we're talking about sacrificing something that is of deep value to us because we want to gain something that is of infinitely more and deeper value, life with God. And of course, it's not that we can earn our salvation. That's not what we're getting at. But it's because we know that if we live our lives for Him, with Him at the center, holy lives, that's going to be the very best sort of life that we can possibly live. And giving to God actually gives us the holy life. And I'm convinced that we have not truly learned to live until we have learned to sacrifice. Because holy offering reorients our lives toward God. Woe to those who have never learned to sacrifice. There is something about putting it all on the line, about staking everything on God's goodness and faithfulness that changes our faith and makes it real. It is when we go out there and we sacrifice something for God and say, God, this is my best. This is for you because I desire you above all else. That is the moment where it becomes real to us, where our life is transformed. And sometimes we talk about tests of faith, and those tests, they come. But sacrifice is a little different than that. Sacrifice is when we intentionally make our lives an offering to God. Sacrifice is when we order things and go out on a limb and respond to God's calling. It's not just something that happens. We order our lives as a life towards God, as a sacrifice to Him. That's different. That's a changed attitude. And the Apostle Paul, he was a really great example of this. He saw his life as a living sacrifice. He saw his ministry to these unruly and troubled and struggling and conflictive churches. He saw his ministry as this drink offering poured out for the benefit of God's people. And that's the way he lived, and that's the way he conducted himself. You see this in Acts chapter 20, when Paul goes and he visits the Ephesian elders, right, these leaders in the church, and he's talking to them, and he says, I'm on my way to Jerusalem, and I know that suffering and bondage and difficulty and pain await me there in Jerusalem. And they say, Paul, don't go. But Paul says this. They wept with him. Paul says this, I do not count my life of any value to myself, if only I may finish my course in the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the good news of God's grace. And this is beautiful because it is really the secret to living out this the sacrificial life. The secret is the connection that Paul made. It's what we're doing when we live the way he is. It's not making our own heroic self-sacrifice that comes from the goodness of our hearts, but it's leading a life that is joined to the sacrifice of Jesus. We're connecting our little crosses to Jesus' great cross, which is why Jesus said, each day, take up your cross and follow me. You know what? Whenever we make an offering to God, there's a way in which all of the rest of our lives follow and everything else starts to be an offering. One thing leads to another. And I've seen this. We have a dear friend who got connected to somebody who is kind of on the margins of her church. And this person needed a little bit of help cleaning up her garage. And so our friend went and helped clean up this individual's garage. And as she was doing this, it became clear that there was way more going on than a dirty garage. There were some hoarding issues and some mental health issues and maybe even some drug abuse issues. And so our friend then kind of walked with her and listened to her and helped her. And this led to bigger and bigger questions until even at one point this individual sold the house she was living in, gave it all up, or it was repossessed by the bank or something. And she ended up moving to Portland and ended up living on the streets and as a homeless individual. And our friend, after several months, was able to track down this individual and go and meet with her in Portland under a bridge and just kind of connect with her and say, what's next? Where are you at? How's life? How can we bless you? And one thing led to another. One sacrifice led to this all-in attitude, this service to God and to this individual. And I'm convinced that's the logic that Leviticus is getting at. That's the logic that Jesus taught. That's what Paul knew and modeled. That's what we're called to. When we bring an offering, it's a way for us to then offer our entire lives to God. Jesus taught that if you're going to live a life for God, it's going to be a life offered to God. And he said, whoever wants to save their life will lose it. And he said, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. He said, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves. He says, let them take up their cross and follow me. And that is what Leviticus is pointing us towards. It's this life given wholly, 100%, everything in, all of it to God. It's this holy life. It's this dedicated life. And all of that is possible through a holy offering. Through giving something, we learn to give all of it to God. And I think that is when, like Leviticus teaches, everything becomes an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen.